Well, here we are again in Hebrews 11 and video 2. We're starting in verse 8. If you missed the first part, the introductory, first 7 verses and some introductory comments, go back to the previous video before moving on. And here we are learning about Abraham now in this section. So in verse 8, by faith Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. I wonder how often you felt like that in your own life. He did not know where he was going. Sometimes we think we do know, but God has other plans. And by faith, let's trust him for our unseen future. Verse 9, by faith he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. Sometimes when God calls us to something new, it seems like a massive leap of faith to just get started, to make the initial steps, like Abraham leaving his home country. The truth is, the arrival often takes as much faith as the departure did. For Abraham, his new situation meant he was a stranger, a nomad, living in tents, which was not that unusual, but it's pointed out, I think, to set us up to the next verse, verse 10. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. So these founders of our faith, starting with Abraham, were not just heirs of the promised land through their descendants. They saw with their spiritual eyes the true kingdom of God that lasts forever. And the verb looking forward has the sense of he expected with absolute confidence, with continuous expectation. After all this was a city with foundations and whose architect and builder are God. Verse 11, and by faith even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. Verse 12, and so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and countless as the sand on the seashore. And here I see a triple reason to doubt, triple temptation to doubt. Number one, Sarah was unable to bear children from the start anyway. Number two, now she was past childbearing age in addition. And then finally, now Abraham, it says, was as good as dead. And I think that means the biological requirements for baby making were no longer present in his body. But faith bears fruit. And the multitudes of descendants that Abraham had, verse 12, bear witness to that. So we've looked at 3 heroes before the flood in our first video who taught us about worship and walk and willingness. And now we've seen the faith of Abraham. We're going to carry on with Abraham, but there's time for an interval, time to reflect and take stock. So a summary in verses 13 to 16 follows. 13, all these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. Interesting, they only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. This is a challenge for all of us as we get older. Let's continue in faith to the end. The next section will deal with a few faith-filled deathbeds. Faith is meant to last a lifetime, and these people did not receive the things promised, it says here. Now that's faith. In the natural, they may not have seen them, but in the spiritual, they certainly did. They knew they were strangers on earth, not just strangers when they left their home. They knew that the ultimate promises are fulfilled beyond the grave. Verse 14, people who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. 15, if they had been thinking of the country they'd left, they'd have had opportunity to return. And if their hearts, I think, had been in the country they'd left behind, they could have turned back. But for them, that just wasn't an option. And for us, when we step out in faith, turning back mustn't be an option. God's promises are too great. And by faith, we continue towards what we hope for, like the ancients. Verse 16, instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. That word better, I don't know if you've been listening to the other videos, but it seems to be one of the writer's favourite words. The preceding chapters have taught us that Jesus is better in numerous ways than anyone, than many people. And we belong to a better covenant. But all of this leads to the ultimate better destiny that we can look forward to. Heaven. Anyway, back to Abraham and his descendants. Verse 17. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promise was about to sacrifice his one and only son. 18. Even though God had said to him, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. See, Abraham has shown his faith in this passage already through his setting off into an unseen future and his belief in an impossible promise. And now in verse 17, it reminds us that God tested him and how he responded again in faith. When he left his homeland, he surrendered his past. When he waited for a child, he trusted God with the present. But now, offering that child, the miracle baby Isaac, back to God, he's trusting God with the future. Everything about Abraham has been tested inside and out. And the word offered, where he offered Isaac, suggests it was as good as done. He offered. Abraham was not hovering over Isaac with a knife, looking over his shoulder for an angel, waiting for the angel to come and stop Abraham. His mind was set on actually going through with the sacrifice. Wow, why? Well, 19 tells us Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead. And so, in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. Abraham never doubted in this situation. In the Genesis account, he tells his servants to wait while he goes ahead with Isaac. Then he says to them, we will worship and then we will come back to you. Not then I will come back to you. Somehow Abraham knew he would return with the child. Remember our opening verses. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, things that God has revealed and has promised. Isaac's survival was essential for God's promise to be fulfilled. Isaac was part of God's promise, which was not yet fully manifest. So Abraham must have been putting his faith in God's promise more than his immediate instructions. Is it possible that we might be asked by God to do something that seemingly contradicts what he has promised? I've certainly heard many stories of people who had to surrender under God's instruction, a dream or something hoped for, only to see God's hand at work later on. Trust him. He knows what he's doing and he has the master plan. And you certainly don't. When he speaks, obey and don't delay. So what happened to little Isaac after that? Well, we haven't time for that, and it looks like the author didn't as well, because we jump right to his deathbed. And in the next section, we deal with a few kind of faith-filled deathbeds, and we'll deal with that in the next video. And I hope to see you there for Hebrews chapter 11, video 3.